Good evening, and welcome back to Midnight Murmurs. Tonight, we conclude The Listener by Algernon Blackwood. Over the past several nights, an ordinary room has become a place of restless dreams, whispered thoughts, and an unseen presence that refuses to leave. As the narrator's grip on reason begins to slip, every sound, every shadow, and every silence seems to conceal something dreadful. But some horrors are not supernatural. Some are all too real. Dim the lights, settle in, and join me for the conclusion of The Listener. December 1. I feel genuinely alarmed and uneasy over the state of my nerves. Dreams are dreams, but never before have I had dreams in broad daylight. I am looking forward very much to Chapter's arrival. He is a capital fellow, vigorous, healthy, with no nerves, and even less imagination, and he has £2,000 a year into the bargain. Periodically, he makes me offers. The last was to travel around the world with him as secretary, which was a delicate way of paying my expenses and giving me some pocket money offers, however, which I invariably decline. I prefer to keep his friendship. Women could not come between us. Money might, therefore, I give it no opportunity. Chapter always laughed at what he called my fancies, being himself possessed only of that thin-blooded quality of imagination which is ever associated with the prosaic-minded man. Yet, if taunted with this obvious lack, his wrath is deeply stirred. His psychology is that of the crass materialist, always a rather funny article. It will afford me genuine relief, none the less, to hear the cold judgment his mind will have to pass upon the story of this house as I shall have it to tell. And December 2. The strangest part of it all I have not referred to in this brief diary. Truth to tell, I have been afraid to set it down in black and white. I have kept it in the background of my thoughts, preventing it as far as possible from taking shape. In spite of my efforts, however, it has continued to grow stronger. Now that I come to face the issue squarely, it is harder to express than I imagined. Like a half-remembered melody that trips in the head but vanishes the moment you try to sing it, these thoughts form a group in the background of my mind, behind my mind, as it were, and refuse to come forward. They are crouching, ready to spring, but the actual leap never takes place. In these rooms, except when my mind is strongly concentrated on my own work, I find myself suddenly dealing in thoughts and ideas that are not my own. New, strange conceptions, wholly foreign to my temperament, are forever cropping up in my head. What precisely they are is of no particular importance. The point is that they are entirely apart from the channel in which my thoughts have hitherto been accustomed to flow. Especially, they come when my mind is at rest unoccupied, when I'm dreaming over the fire or sitting with a book which fails to hold my attention. Then these thoughts which are not mine spring into life and make me feel exceedingly uncomfortable. Sometimes they are so strong that I almost feel as if someone were in the room beside me thinking aloud. Evidently, my nerves and liver are shockingly out of order. I must work harder and take more vigorous exercise. The horrid thoughts never come when my mind is much occupied, but they are always there waiting, and, as it were, alive. What I have attempted to describe above came first upon me gradually after I had been some days in the house, and then grew steadily in strength. The other strange thing has come to me only twice in all these weeks. It appalls me. It is the consciousness of the propinquity of some deadly and loathsome disease. It comes over me like a wave of fever, heat, and then passes off, leaving me cold and trembling. The air seems for a few seconds to become tainted. So penetrating and convincing is the thought of this sickness that on both occasions my brain has turned momentarily dizzy, and through my mind, like flames of white heat, have flashed the ominous names of all the dangerous illnesses I know. I can no more explain these visitations than I can fly. Yet I know there is no dreaming about the clammy skin and palpitating heart which they always leave as witnesses of their brief visit. Most strongly of all was I aware of this nearness of a mortal sickness when, on the night of the 28th, I went upstairs in pursuit of the listening figure. When we were shut in together in that little square room under the roof, I felt that I was face to face with the actual essence of this invisible and malignant disease. Such a feeling never entered my heart before, and I pray to God it never may again. There! Now I have confessed. I have given some expression, at least, to the feelings that so far I have been afraid to see in my own writing. For since I can no longer deceive myself, the experiences of that night, 28th, were no more a dream than my daily breakfast is a dream. And the trivial entry in this diary, by which I sought to explain away an occurrence that caused me unutterable horror, was due solely to my desire not to acknowledge in words what I really felt and believed to be true. The increase that would have accrued to my horror by so doing might have been more than I could stand. And December 3. I wish chapter would come. My facts are already marshaled, and I can see his cool gray eyes fixed incredulously on my face as I relate them. The knocking at my door, the well-dressed caller, the light in the upper window and the shadow upon the blind, the man who preceded me in the snow, the scattering of my clothes at night, Emily's arrested confession, the landlady's suspicious reticence, the midnight listener on the stairs, and those awful subsequent words in my sleep. And above all, and hardest to tell, the presence of the abominable sickness and the stream of thoughts and ideas that are not my own. I can see Chapter's face, and I can almost hear his deliberate words. You've been at the tea again, and underfeeding, I expect, as usual. Better see my nerve doctor, and then come with me to the south of France. For this fellow, who knows nothing of disordered liver or high-strung nerves, goes regularly to a great nerve specialist with the periodical belief that his nervous system is beginning to decay. December 5. Ever since the incident of the listener, I have kept a nightlight burning in my bedroom, and my sleep has been undisturbed. Last night, however, I was subjected to a far worse annoyance. I woke suddenly and saw a man in front of the dressing table regarding himself in the mirror. The door was locked, as usual. I knew at once it was the listener, and the blood turned to ice in my veins. Such a wave of horror and dread swept over me that it seemed to turn me rigid in the bed, and I could neither move nor speak. I noted, however, that the odor I so abhorred was strong in the room. The man seemed to be tall and broad. He was stooping forward over the mirror. His back was turned to me, but in the glass I saw the reflection of a huge head and face illumined fitfully by the flicker of the nightlight. The spectral gray of very early morning stealing in round the edges of the curtains lent an additional horror to the picture, for it fell upon the hair that was tawny and mane-like, hanging about a face whose swollen, rugose features bore the once seen, never forgotten leonine expression of, I dare not write down that awful word. But, by way of corroborative proof, I saw in the faint mingling of the two lights that there were several bronze-colored blotches on the cheeks which the man was evidently examining with great care in the glass. The lips were pale and very thick and large. One hand I could not see, but the other rested on the ivory back of my hairbrush. Its muscles were strangely contracted, the fingers thin to emaciation, the back of the hand closely puckered up. It was like a big gray spider crouching to spring, or the claw of a great bird. The full realization that I was alone in the room with this nameless creature, almost within arm's reach of him, overcame me to such a degree that, when he suddenly turned and regarded me with small, beady eyes, wholly out of proportion to the grandeur of their massive setting, I sat bolt upright in bed, uttered a loud cry, and then fell back in a dead swoon of terror upon the bed. 1. December 6. When I came to this morning, the first thing I noticed was that my clothes were strewn all over the floor. I find it difficult to put my thoughts together and have sudden accesses of violent trembling. I determined that I would go at once to Chapter's hotel and find out when he is expected. I cannot refer to what happened in the night. It is too awful, and I have to keep my thoughts rigorously away from it. I feel lightheaded and queer, couldn't eat any breakfast, and have twice vomited with blood. While dressing to go out, a hansom rattled up noisily over the cobbles, and a minute later the door opened, and to my great joy in walked the very subject of my thoughts. The sight of his strong face and quiet eyes had an immediate effect upon me, and I grew calmer again. His very handshake was a sort of tonic. But, as I listened eagerly to the deep tones of his reassuring voice, and the visions of the night-time paled a little, I began to realize how very hard it was going to be to tell him my wild, intangible tale. Some men radiate an animal vigor that destroys the delicate woof of a vision and effectually prevents its reconstruction. Chapter was one of these men. We talked of incidents that had filled the interval since we last met, and he told me something of his travels. He talked, and I listened. But so full was I of the horrid thing I had to tell that I made a poor listener. I was forever watching my opportunity to leap in and explode it all under his nose. Before very long, however, it was borne in upon me that he too was merely talking for time. He too held something of importance in the background of his mind, something too weighty to let fall till the right moment presented itself. So that during the whole of the first half hour, we were both waiting for the psychological moment in which properly to release our respective bombs, and the intensity of our minds' actions set up opposing forces that merely sufficed to hold one another in check and nothing more. As soon as I realized this, therefore, I resolved to yield. I renounced for the time my purpose of telling my story, and had the satisfaction of seeing that his mind, released from the restraint of my own, at once began to make preparations for the discharge of its momentous burden. The talk grew less and less magnetic, the interest waned, the descriptions of his travels became less alive. There were pauses between his sentences. Presently he repeated himself. His words clothed no living thoughts. The pauses grew longer. Then the interest dwindled altogether, and went out like a candle in the wind. His voice ceased, and he looked up squarely into my face with serious and anxious eyes. The psychological moment had come at last. "I say," he began, and then stopped short. I made an unconscious gesture of encouragement, but said no word. I dreaded the impending disclosure exceedingly. A dark shadow seemed to precede it. "I say," he blurted out at last, "what in the world made you ever come to this place, to these rooms, I mean?" "They're cheap, for one thing," I began, "and central, and—" "They're too cheap," he interrupted. "Didn't you ask what made 'em so cheap?" It never occurred to me at the time. There was a pause in which he avoided my eyes. "For God's sake, go on, man, and tell it," I cried, for the suspense was getting more than I could stand in my nervous condition. "This was where Blount lived so long," he said quietly, "and where he died. You know, in the old days, I often used to come here and see him, and do what I could to alleviate his—" He stuck fast again. "Well," I said with a great effort, "please go on faster." "But," Chapter went on, turning his face to the window with a perceptible shiver, "he finally got so terrible I simply couldn't stand it, though I always thought I could stand anything. It got on my nerves and made me dream, and haunted me day and night." I stared at him and said nothing. I had never heard of Blount in my life, and didn't know what he was talking about, but all the same, I was trembling, and my mouth had become strangely dry. "This is the first time I've been back here since," he said almost in a whisper, "and, 'pon my word, it gives me the creeps. I swear it isn't fit for a man to live in. I never saw you look so bad, old man." "I've got it for a year," I jerked out with a forced laugh. "Signed the lease and all. I thought it was rather a bargain." Chapter shuddered and buttoned his overcoat up to his neck. Then he spoke in a low voice. looking occasionally behind him as though he thought someone was listening. I, too, could have sworn someone else was in the room with us. He did it himself, and no one blamed him a bit. His sufferings were awful. For the last 2 years he used to wear a veil when he went out, and even then it was always in a closed carriage. Even the attendant who had nursed him for so long was at length obliged to leave. The extremities of both the lower limbs were gone, dropped off, and he moved about the ground on all fours with a sort of crawling motion. The odor, too, was— I was obliged to interrupt him here. I could hear no more details of that sort. My skin was moist. I felt hot and cold by turns, for at last I was beginning to understand. Poor devil, Chapter went on. I used to keep my eyes closed as much as possible. He always begged to be allowed to take his veil off, and asked if I minded very much. I used to stand by the open window. He never touched me, though. He rented the whole house. Nothing would induce him to leave it. Did he occupy these very rooms? No. He had the little room on the top floor, the square one just under the roof. He preferred it because it was dark. These rooms were too near the ground, and he was afraid people might see him through the windows. A crowd had been known to follow him up to the very door and then stand below the windows in the hope of catching a glimpse of his face. But there were hospitals. He wouldn't go near one, and they didn't like to force him. They say it's not contagious, so there was nothing to prevent his staying here if he wanted to. He spent all his time reading medical books about drugs and so on. His head and face were something appalling, just like a lion's. I held up my hand to arrest further description. He was a burden to the world, and he knew it. One night I suppose he realized it too keenly to wish to live. He had the free use of drugs, and in the morning he was found dead on the floor. 2 years ago, that was, and they said then he had still several years to live. Then, in heaven's name, I cried, unable to bear the suspense any longer, tell me what it was he had, and be quick about it. I thought you knew, he exclaimed, with genuine surprise. I thought you knew. He leaned forward and our eyes met. In a scarcely audible whisper, I caught the words his lips seemed almost afraid to utter. He was a leper. You've been listening to Midnight Murmurs. If you enjoyed tonight's story, consider following the podcast and leaving a rating or review. It helps others discover these timeless tales and supports the continuation of the series. Until next time, lock your doors, keep a light burning, and if you ever find yourself hearing footsteps where none should be, perhaps it's best not to listen too closely. Good night.